I'm Josh Liston from On the Bubble podcast, a proud member of the Gunner Geek Network, just like the show you're listening to now. The opinions expressed are those of each individual host. Check out all the other podcasts at gunnergeeknetwork.com and get ready, because geekiness begins in 3, 2, 1.
It's time to get the show started. So welcome to episode number 146 of Better Podcasting. On this show, Steven reviews 10 years of podcasting.
In this week's Better Podcasting download, we talk about abandoned podcasts.
In this week's Better Podback, we take your feedback, including somebody who asked about redundant recordings.
Finally, we'll have a moment of silence for a possible loss in the world of SP gear. Lauren, start the show now.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your host for the show, Stephen John Drew and Stargate Pioneer.
Hello and welcome to an all-new episode of Better Podcasting. I am Stephen John Drew, and with me, of course, is Stargate Pioneer.
It's been a great 2 weeks to have to myself without Steven around and actually get a few things done around the house. It's been a crazy year. It's been a crazy summer. So I thank everybody, our listeners, for the patience in taking the week off. Of course, if you're listening to this years down the road, there is no week off. You just go to the next episode. That's what's great about time displaced content.
Absolutely. And I got to say this, by the way, I ended up having a bit of a change in my schedule, and I still took the time to myself, and it was glorious because I got to spend more family time. And we've talked about that here as hobby podcasters. You make time for the family, but we are here to also make time for you. And how we like to do that from time to time is by giving you the floor. And when we give you the floor, what we do is SP goes to the local home center and he buys some laminate or hardwood of your choosing. He lays it out, and then he says, you should tell us how you saved your podcast. And we encourage you to let us know how exactly you saved your podcast. If something went wrong, he's going to build this floor for you to stand on and say how you saved your podcast so we can all learn together.
You know, Steven, it's kind of like the Grand Tour on Amazon. You know, when they have the tent they take from city to city and they build the state. You know what I'm talking about? You're a Grand Tour fan, right?
Yeah, but clearly you haven't watched season 2.
No, I haven't made it that far yet. It's on the list of things to stream. In any case, yes, we usually ask our listeners, you, to tell us how you've saved your podcast so we could share with everybody and we can then take corrective actions on our own podcasts. Or I go out and find a story and then we talk about it here. And that is called How I Could Have Saved My Podcast. And that's what we have today. So this is from a Reddit post titled Starting Out with Nothing. And then my caveat is, well, almost nothing. And the reason I say that is because there's already a computer involved. Anyway, here's what the post says. Quote, I'm looking to start a podcast. I'm sure you've all heard this before too, but no harm in asking. I've been living paycheck to paycheck for the most part, and I have a decent computer with a Logitech headset that has a pretty quality microphone. I can't afford to pay for a crazy cool microphone, and since I am just starting out, I don't think that's necessary until I really find a flow and niche. I like to have a co-host too that has done podcasts before or knows the ropes. I know how to use Audacity in the most basic sense, but I could use some tips that anyone can drop for me about anything related to starting out a podcast with virtually nothing. As far as my content, my passions are horror, the unexplained, traditional family values and how to uphold them, addiction recovery, true crime, and internet anomalies such as Chris Chan. If anyone would like to send me a DM as well and talk to me, that would be cool. I appreciate all of you and really love this subreddit. Thanks. And this is from the podcasting subreddit, which Bangs Naughty Bits moderates. So thank you very much, Bangs, for making this possible. So, Stephen, I see in the document that you're highlighting a couple of key words there. So I want to hear your thoughts. I think our audience deserves to listen to what your thoughts are on this.
All right, so I want to hone in on the part where they said that they have a Logitech headset that has pretty quality sound, according to their ears, of course. I'll just go ahead and say right now, probably not. Like, compared to other things, you know, you might think it sounds great, but in reality, compared to some of the things like the ATR 2100, probably not as good. But it's probably a heck of a lot better than many other alternatives and a fantastic starting point for you as a new podcaster. So I think that that's pretty... Yes, I would like to see people go the extra mile and whatnot, but it's a lot better than talking in to your Logitech webcam instead.
And honestly, if you're going to start a podcast like this, you're probably not looking forward to being on the internet for 10 years. I mean, the subject matters that he was talking about, you know, maybe addiction recovery in there maybe would be still relevant 10, 20 years down the road, even 5 years down the road. But the rest of it, I think, is time-dependent content. So if he goes with any one of those, I assume it's a he, by the way. I don't actually know. But I assume if he goes with any of these content, I don't think it's going to be a big, huge deal if episode 1 is something that he would like to hide in 3 years from now when he actually maybe gets to save up a little bit of money and goes for that Samsung Q2U, that Audio-Technica AT2005 or ATR 2100, which we would recommend for somebody starting for a lot of different reasons. But yeah, I mean, I started on a chat headset. I know it's possible. It's just not what we would recommend on Better Podcasting, although starting is better than not starting. So there you go.
Absolutely. The other thing that I wanted to highlight about this here was it's a really neat idea, getting a co-host that can show the ropes. And what a cool opportunity for that co-host. Like that's a neat little mentoring style relationship. I think that's a really cool idea.
I've heard it two ways. I've heard, yeah, you want somebody to mentor you and take you along. And actually, I had that happen with me when I actually started my first show, not just guessing on, which was Voices of Defiance. I had Sean come on, who had been podcasting for years, kind of help me along the way. And of course, you were helping me too a little bit, Stephen. But there is something to be said about taking a host and molding them that doesn't know anything. And then you could say, okay, this is the way it is. We're going to do it this way. Don't argue with me. It's going to be this way and we're going to have fun and we're going to get it out. I mean, it's two ways. So either you're grabbing somebody that doesn't know anything or you're going for that experience. And if you're too inexperienced podcasters, I mean, that works too, but you're going to have to listen to Better Podcasting because there's a lot you need to know.
The last thing I wanted to highlight about this neat little relationship here was that if you were somebody who was found in that possible mentor role, I'd probably have a pretty frank conversation about it and make sure you're not just getting manipulated, so to speak, into doing all the work. Because the idea here is being pitched as showing the ropes. And last thing you want is for that person to just go, yeah, okay. Oh, wow, you're doing a great job of editing. Just keep doing it. Show them the ropes, right? So establish that relationship early on so that if you end up in that situation, you say, hey, time for you to take that ball and run with it.
It's interesting that you use the term mentoring because that's actually a specific term and coaching is another specific term. They actually mean slightly different things. But in a mentoring relationship, you're talking about expectations. The biggest thing that you have to do is you have to sit down before you start the mentoring process and you have to map out what expectations are on both sides. It's just part of a good mentoring process. And it applies here to podcasting too. Like if you have somebody that's actually your mentor, I would definitely reach out, get those expectations. You might want to do it in writing. I've heard of contracts, but you don't have to as long as you verbally understand what the difference is in what your expectations are. So that's just a little tip from SP, who recently took a coaching and mentoring class.
Ooh. All right. Well, let's go ahead and talk about 10 years. I'm just going to just say 10 years. That's all it's going to be. The entire segment is just me saying 10 years.
10 years, 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 10 years. We're coming up on International Podcasting Day, and it's September 30th I almost said 13. It's September 30th every year. And in our coverage of the event in past years, we've discussed the history of podcasting. So if you're new to Better Podcasting, first of all, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for listening. But if you are indeed new to Better Podcasting, we have covered the history of podcasting before, how Adam Curry and Dave Weiner have been credited as inventing podcasting in September of 2004. And if that's true, podcasting has only officially been around for 14 years. And because podcasting was so new in the early 2000s, there were less podcasts available then. I mean, there weren't 550,000 podcasts in 2005. So finding somebody who has been podcasting in the 10 to 14 year range is rare. It's not unheard of, but it is rare. Also, with the high pod fade rate of somewhere, I've heard everything between 3 and 8 episodes. So pod fade means if you are starting a podcast, you make it to episode 3 or episode 8, and then that's it. You stop. That's called early pod fade rate. And if you make it past that, it's still special for a podcaster, and it's special for a podcaster to even make it to like 100 episodes, 200 episodes, whatever. But finding somebody who has started podcasting in those first 5 years of podcasting, like 2004 to 2008, and has been resilient enough to continue podcasting to today is an accomplishment worthy of heralding from the mountaintops, or, the transmitters or the internet or whatever your metaphor may be. With that in mind, it is actually today my honor and pleasure to take the next few minutes and have kind of a conversational interview going in depth with a podcaster who has just had his 10th year podiversary, Stephen Jondrew. Hey, Stephen, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Oh, sorry. Is this where I speak? I'm sorry. I've never done one of these before.
Yeah, that was the big lead in. And this is you that is now pleased to be on the show and ready to be interviewed at the 10-year mark.
Oh, wow. Oh, I don't know. I'm not prepared for this at all.
So you're not ready? So maybe we should stop recording until you're ready to go? Or can we go ahead and do this?
I'll wing it.
Okay, wait. That sounds great. Okay, let's start off with a simple question. 10 years is a long time for anything. Think of how many TV shows have made it to the 10-year mark. I mean, very few. There's been several, but only a few. It's definitely a long time to podcast. So in those 10 years, what types of shows have you done?
All right. So the first one that I ever did was actually a sort of typical guys over beers type podcast. It was technically a music podcast. I actually won't say the name because I gave up the domain a long time ago, and I've tried to get it back and I haven't got it back. So the hashtag regrets. The other one that I did was...
Oh, wait a minute. Regrets or podgrets?
Oh, yes. Hashtag podgrets. That's right. Fanboy Buzz was a comic book podcast that I did, and it was really the first long-term project that I tried to get a following on. It was kind of the first structured podcast that I did as well, but also had some off-the-rail elements. One of the fun little niche chapters in my pod life was Walking the Walking Dead podcast, which was a Walking Dead fan podcast. This was, of course, for fans of the television show The Walking Dead. You might have heard about this show before. One of the ones that has been my most creative, I will say, is the GonnaGeek.com official show, which is still going on right now. A weekly geek news show, but it has a whole bunch of other geek stuff. And then there's this other one that I did, and not sure if you've heard about it before, but it's called Better Podcasting, and I host it with another guy. And yeah, he's sometimes there, sometimes not there.
Sounds pretty, I don't know, ironic. A podcast with podcasting in the name. Huh.
Yes.
I'll have to go check that one out. I'll have to subscribe and listen to a few episodes.
Very meta.
All right. So the first podcast you mentioned was basically guys podcasting over beers. We'll just call it that since you're not going to disclose the name of it. So those types of podcasts often get a bad rap in established podcasting circles, 3 guys, 1 brain, guys podcasting with beers, whatever. So while there are many reasons that we advocate against these type of shows on Better Podcasting due to sustainability, long-term entertainment value, or ability to grow beyond a certain level, was there anything you learned from the one guy podcasting over beer show that you started with.
Yes, I will say that while I have a ton of regrets about a show like this, it's actually, I learned a lot of basics and really the foundation for podcasting things. It gave me the opportunity to figure out things like Audacity, hadn't used that before, RSS feed building, because it was 10 years ago, that's right, submission to iTunes and other places like that. And also because there was 10 years ago, there was a lot less support easily available than there is now. And so there was a lot of just figuring out that I had to do. Now, my first show was actually only like 14 episodes over the course of about 14 months. So it was really staggered out. But I actually wouldn't trade this for me as a starting point because of the fact that I was able to have that sort of buffer from episode to episode, really learning the ways of podcasting and just allowing me to take my sweet, sweet time.
Yeah, that was a big thing with my first podcast, just doing one podcast a week. I remember my first editing stint, I timed it. It was like 26 hours for like a 45-minute show. So there are things that you need to learn along the way. And I could see, especially if you really haven't caught the podcasting bug, if you don't know if you're going to sustain it, I could see why you want to spread out those episodes a little bit more. I mean, we would advocate a weekly podcast if you're starting out. It gets you in the routine. You get to build an audience and all that stuff. But go at your own rate. I would echo that. Okay, so let's move on to the next question, Stephen, if you're ready. So over 10 years of podcasting, there's got to be a lot of fun memories to share. I know I've experienced a few myself over my few years. So if you can, could you pick out one standout moment? And I'll caveat that from each of your shows. So one standout moment from each of those shows you just rattled off.
The first podcast that I did, music podcast, honestly, one of the highlights from that was that I found out a local radio personality enjoyed the show. He ended up guesting on it as such, and this gave me the confidence boost that I needed, because at the time I was really realistic about it. I'm like, who's listening? A bunch of downloads in China. So who knows who's listening? And then reached out and said that liked listening to the show. And so that was really quite the confidence boost that I needed there to realize, okay, you can do a podcast and people might listen. The comic book podcast, Fanboy Buzz, this sounds kind of bad, but it's not really. It was actually turmoil. There was a lot of, quite honestly, behind the scenes things that came up and issues. And through the run of the Fanboy Buzz, I learned how to adapt to these situations and end up moving forward with the podcast. Early on, we ended up having a big co-host swap. And I remember actually, I was doing a bit of side work on the weekend then, and I actually went, and when this came up, and it's all I could think about all day was about this co-host switch that had to happen. And then it all worked out in the end. And honestly, the second set of hosts were far better than the first, in my opinion. No offense, just was better mesh and gel of the team. And so it ended up working out. But I remember being so stressed, and just learning to be dynamic with that. It was definitely a standout moment within the Fanboy Buzz. The GonnaGeek.com show, definitely video. Video has been one of the biggest standout moments for me there. Yes, there's been a whole bunch of other things like the GonnaGeek.com podcast awards, the GonnaGeek.com Christmas special, a whole bunch of stuff, but a lot of them have been video based. On the Walking Dead podcast, I gotta say, this was really fun to learn how to try to create a show for fans when you were having troubles with the source material, because we didn't want to lie. We didn't want to say that we liked the show when we were really struggling at the time to really like the show, but we were able to sort of look at what can we do to still engage the fans, give our opinions, but also not come off as just a big hate fest. So that was a really fun way, a really fun standout moment for that show. And then for Better Podcasting here, I gotta say, the audience engagement, no offense to any of the other audiences, but Better Podcasting just has a completely different type of audience engagement. There's much more passion that comes along, a lot more engagement we get, and just a lot more audience support. So it's a different type of audience engagement. And I got to say that that's definitely the standout moment here that I got with Better Podcasting.
I had the opportunity to actually co-host a couple. You had me come on guest host a couple of the episodes of Walking the Walking Dead. That was a fun podcast for the time. And I think that was about the time that I was waning from my desire to podcast on that show too. It happens. If you start podcasting on the subject and you lose the passion for it, not the passion for podcasting, but the passion for the subject. That could definitely be an issue. And then Fanboy Buzz, you talked about the turmoil behind the scene. We've both been, joking aside from everything that's been happening with Better Podcasting, me firing you twice a year, or you firing me, or leaving the set or whatever. That's all behind the scenes fun, guys. There's nothing between the two of us. We've never gone a week and said, I just don't want to podcast with you. That's never been a case here on Better Podcasting. However, on other shows that we've done, it wasn't the turmoil that you've done with Fanboy Buzz, but we've had to change co-hosts for a variety of different reasons. Maybe some people have lost the passion for that show, and we've been able to bring on some people that have the passion for whatever we're podcasting on, or maybe there's just a personality difference between people or whatever, and the show goes on. So there is turmoil. We both experience turmoil on podcast. I don't want to minimize that. It has, if you have co-hosts, that's going to happen. If you get into it with your fans, that's another thing. So it's not all rainbows and roses with podcasting. You will face some adversity along the ways, especially if you've been podcasting as long as Stephen has, over 10 years. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Let's change it up for a second, get away from the old podcast. Let's get technical for a minute here. I mean, this is Better Podcasting after all. We love our gear. And you know that I love the microphones like the ATR 2100, the AT2005, and the Samsung Q2U. And I always recommend it, just like I did at the beginning of the show, for people that are starting out. But what gear did you start out with? And do you stand by your decision to use it?
Ooh, I like that. Okay, so first off, I've established this before. 10 years ago, the AT2005 ATR 2100 did not exist. However, that was still my first microphone because I'm a time traveler, and I actually traveled to the future, grabbed it, brought it back, and started recording with it. That's how much I like that microphone.
For the record, I did look at the date that the ATR 2100 was first available on Amazon. This is not necessarily the first date that it was available. It was 2011, and podcasting started in 2004.
There you go. So, okay, joking aside, my first podcast was a group of guys over beers. I told you that, which means that we had to have multiple microphones. I was not a condenser in the middle of the room type of guys. I knew every podcaster should have a microphone. So what did I do? Because I had so little budget back then. I ended up getting a couple of random generic microphones. One of them I had laying around. One of them I managed to get super cheap at the local music store. And the other one was what's called a SingStar microphone. That's right. There's a wonderful game that involves microphones, and it came with a microphone. So I hooked those up to a crummy little Radio Shack, I think it was, branded video mixer, and used that video mixer as an audio mixer. And that's how I made it work. Honestly, hearing it back, audio was terrible. Absolutely garbage. I sounded extraordinarily nasally, and that was also in addition to the fact that the microphone was thin sounding. And really, it just was terrible audio. But I absolutely stand by my decision because I had that accessible, and it got me going. Without using this SingStar microphone, I would have not probably started podcasting. So yes, I do stand by that crummy hardware back then. If I was to do it now, I would still advocate an ATR 2100.
Yeah, I remember back when I first was starting out, and I just didn't want to sink a lot of money into it. I really didn't. So maybe my desire wasn't really there at the time, but I did have a desire to be on podcasts. So that's why I grabbed the chat headsets. And, looking back, I sound so bad on those episodes. It wasn't my show, by the way. I started off my show with a dynamic cardioid microphone with Voices of Defiance, but yeah, those microphones, less than to be desired, but I started. I guess that's the point, is just start no matter what you got. You might not be competitive, but you get to go through your learning process. You get your high school degree basically in podcasting. So yeah, I'll echo that. As much as it pains me, because I will only listen to podcasts with better audio, but so that means I will not listen to those old shows that I was on unless I'm reminiscing. All right, let's continue on the subject of gear, Stephen. And you've regularly shared with me and our audience, by the way, that you have been able to create DIY, and for those that aren't in the lingo, that's do it yourself, solutions that you've done to basically push your gear boundaries. what is your favorite DIY solution that you ever did with podcasting?
So that's going to come to a couple of different highlights, both of them early on. Number one was I did the classic embroidery pantyhose pop filter because I couldn't afford a pop filter. Back 10 years ago, Amazon.ca was pretty crummy. Everything was really expensive for music gear. So it was either wait 8 weeks to come from China or wherever it was coming from, or make myself a pop filter. And because I was, podcasting sort of from the seat of my pants, I built myself a pop filter. It was taking an embroidery ring and just going to the dollar store and getting some pantyhose. And the bonus with that was I had pantyhose to wear too. So that was another bonus there. The other thing was I actually early on, first podcast I ever did, I made myself some mic flags. I went to Michael's and I bought some of that foam. You like take flowers and you put at the bottom or whatever. I built some mic flags out of that and I painted them. And the best part about that was the paint that I used started to eat away at the foam. So it lasted 3-4 weeks before it was just crumbling everywhere. So those are my best highlight DIY moments. On a more advanced note, I will say this, though, that really looking at the audio gear that you have and thinking about whether or not what you want to do can be done with what you have is one of the standout DIY moments for myself. And a great example of that is my old Behringer 1622, I think was the model number. Mm-hmm. I ended up really utilizing that so hard with different mix minuses, way beyond what it was supposed to do, as well as the original 802 Behringer mixer that I had. I ended up using panning and stuff to really get more multi-track than it should have supported. And that helped me wait to purchase the next thing and just accomplish what I wanted to accomplish in the equipment that I had, so that I didn't have to go and spend extra money and maybe realize it wasn't what I wanted to do.
So I think Steven's actually trying out to be guesting on the Tested YouTube channel, so you can do all these great builds, these 1 hour builds or whatever. Listen, if you're watching the video on YouTube right now of this show, all you have to do is look at Steven's frame right now, and you will see his wonderful back frame, which he built on his own, including the lighting and everything. I mean, it took several iterations, but he finally got it done. And your brother is the one who provided you that lighted mic flag for your birthday this year. That's awesome. And let's not forget your audio racks that you built by hand to hold your audio rackable mountable gear. So the two that you chose were winners over all that. I think that's telling over the fun that Steven has had over the years of doing DIY on a budget. All right. I'd like to touch upon something else now, the show producing part, actually. And so let's go somewhere that is your passion, live shows. Now, live hasn't always been a part of your podcasting endeavors. I know that. So why'd you start doing it?
Well, when I started podcasting, I still had in the back of my mind, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Stephen Candy John. Oh, wait, sorry, different show. Okay, so no, joking aside, let me say that I actually did live streams before I did podcasting. So because of that, it's a little unfair advantage that I had because I was doing live before I ever got into podcasting. So it was a little more natural. Now, well, wait a minute. Let's caveat that for a second here. Your first passion, you've stated this before, but your first passion was actually something along the lines of broadcast TV. It was. Absolutely it was. I always figured that I would get into some form of video broadcast TV and stuff like that. So that was absolutely the case, which is why I did live audio streams. Occasionally I did some other random video things before I did podcasting. So yeah, absolutely. Who remembers Real Player, by the way? There's your callback.
I think it's still on an XP machine I have somewhere.
Okay, but moving on, the reason why I brought live myself into podcasting was audience engagement. We did this with Fanboy Buzz really first, was where I had done the live podcasting. And correct me if I'm wrong, SP, but audience engagement after the fact can sometimes be hard. It can be hard to get listeners to send you feedback and information and whatnot, right?
It's a lot easier nowadays, but it's still difficult to make them do something that's actually, because they're listening in the car as they're driving, as they're working out, doing stuff that they can't actually reach into their phones and actually communicate back to you. So it is more difficult even now than live.
True. So when we were having this trouble and we would get some very passionate fans with Fanboy Buzz, what we thought we would do was start doing some live broadcasts. And what we could do was advertise that on X day, we're going to do our show live and try to get people right there in the chat room where you could engage with them. Because yes, we did have a chat room going on and whatnot. And it worked because we started off not doing every show, but really like once a month or something like that. And we just made it an event. It was something we could end up publicizing ahead of time and sort of lead up to in the show. And so that was really why I got into live first with podcasting.
Huh. Okay. I thought it was because I came along and said, Steven, we got to do live. I thought that was the reason.
That's true. The first time I ever did live was when I met you, Stargate Pioneer.
So now, years later, with all that live experience under your belt for podcasting, would you ever do a non-live show?
Yes, I would. And why would I? Because of the fact that it's really, really good for people who are starting out, for solo cast, things like that. A lot of the solo podcasters that I hear that just do live grip it and rip it type shows, what do you see them do partway through? They got to drink water. They got to do all of that stuff, right? And because of that, or water, vodka, whatever you want to call it. But because of that, if you're doing like a solo show, you can more so do it offline and really put your best foot forward because you can just take those breaks, replenish and edit them out and nobody sees them. It's a lot easier to do a live podcast where you have a co-host because you can bounce back and forth with each other, in my opinion. The other thing as well is starting off, we've talked about it before on this very show. When we started Better Podcasting, SP and I were experienced podcasters and we took forever to find our groove. And so it's really...
Well, it wasn't forever, but
okay,
it was within the first 10 episodes.
Fair enough. But we still had to find our groove. So if you do it offline first, it's one less factor. And so if I was to start a new show, I would be very tempted to start it offline so that I could really do that. I could record something, go, that's terrible, Steven, hit delete, and move on to the next version.
You know, I've heard a lot of people state that one of the benefits that you could do when you're starting your show is you can actually record, like batch record the first 3 to 5 episodes and then throw them away and then start again from the get-go. And it might sound a little robotic because you've already discussed the content before, but you're in that groove and you can make changes to slight changes to your format or something. I just wouldn't wait too long because if you wait too long, you're never going to get feedback from your audience on what they like and what they don't like. So yes, you can grip it and rip it, record that first episode and throw it out there, or you can do like 3 to 5, record them and then start all over again. Either way works. I just wouldn't wait beyond 5 episodes. That's beyond 5 and you're in danger zone right there. Yeah, I said it, danger zone. Okay. So building off your answer there, I'd like to dive a little bit deeper. So with all the streaming options that are available today, you know, YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, none of which were really available back in the day, and all combining that with all of your live experience, would you recommend to somebody that's just starting out going live to start their podcast?
For most users, I would say no. I think that for most users starting off, you just need that buffer that I spoke about. I think there's so many advantages with starting offline and not doing it live. The only big advantage about doing it live is the fact that most of those services have like a video on demand or a recording archive. So when you inevitably forget to press record, you've got that backup. So that is an advantage. But really, I just found that it was a bit of a uphill battle trying to balance when I first started doing a live podcast, trying to balance my usual producer style duties with also the live style ones. And also I tried to do live call-ins at the time too, so that might have added to it. But absolutely, I think that there's a big advantage to just holding your horses until you get a little bit of podcast experience first.
I've got 3 examples of solo podcasters that I'd like to throw out here right now, Stephen, if you would allow me to on your 10-year anniversary interview here. The first I'll start out with is Bandrew Scott, who does the Bandrew Says podcast. He also does the Podcastage YouTube channel. He does a weekly show called Bandrew Says, And he does not do that live. Now, he does a live Twitch stream, which he plays games or whatever, but his podcast, he records on his own. And he does it with multiple cameras, so he can switch the angle back and forth when he does editing. And I think that works out well for him. Another of the podcasters that I like to point out is Heather Welch. She's actually been on this show before. I've been on her show before, and she's done the 2 Sunshine Summits 2018. She started just a year ago, but she did not start out live. She started doing her podcast, learning how to actually record it, edit it, produce it, publish it. And then she started getting into the streaming realm with her Sunshine Summits. I still can't say that. And I think that worked out great for her because she was able to do a lot of streaming in a condensed period of time, and she was able to learn how to do it. The other podcast I'll talk about, I don't have his permission, so I won't state what it is, but he did apply for our network, and we had a good rapport going back and forth. And there were things about his podcast that I felt that could greatly improve the podcast. And I think it is to his benefit that he not go live, and he hasn't gone live yet. So he's a good podcaster, and it's a good podcast. I think he knows. Yeah, I think he listens to the show, and I think he knows I'm talking about him. And I wish him all the best and to get better. And he has gotten a lot better in the past year. So those are just 3 examples of solo shows and the different parts of streaming in there. I just wanted to throw that out.
Great examples.
Thank you for letting me indulge, Stephen. So I'm going to get away from the live streaming here. I'm going to transition to a big part of your online identity. So about 5 years ago or so, you created, I think it was about 5 years ago, you created the Gonna Geek Network, which has been an incredible community to be a part of and is also constantly improving too. So I give you a lot of credit for that. And you are the owner of Gonna Geek. So as the owner, do you think podcasters should join podcasting networks?
I would say that it depends on the network and really what they are looking to get out of it. Now, the reason why I say that is because of the fact that if you are somebody who is looking to really just build your property yourself, getting in with the mess of a network might not necessarily be the best thing if the network might possibly come in and cause problems down the road, right? There's associations with that network that you can't undo. There are possible legal things depending on how they're set up and whatnot. So I think it really depends on what you're looking to do. The fun fact, though, is that the Fanboy Buzz podcast that I did was actually part of what was called, now I'm drawing a blank on the name, but it was a comic book podcast network. And it was really like a very light version of the Gonna Geek Network, where it was just there for a bunch of people to help each other. In fact, every year I still am on their mailing list where they send out an email saying, hey, we're looking to renew the hosting. We got to do it as a team. Let's get the hosting renewed. And so it was really just a group of people coming together. And what that offered us was just a central website that we could post our show and syndicate our show on. And actually it was really high in the search results when you were searching for comic podcasts. So we could really take advantage of that SEO. And so that was a great fit for Fanboy Buzz because we were at the time trying to monetize it and do other things, but they didn't want any part of that. But if I was trying to join a network and they were like, well, we want to take some of your revenue, I probably would have said no because we were trying to do our own thing. So it really just depends on what you've got for your podcast and the network you're looking to apply. So evaluate both of them.
Yeah, we've done a lot of the evaluation. We talked about it before on this show about how we have a committee to review applications to this network. And the biggest thing there is we're looking at it to protect both entities. We want it to be a good fit for the network, but we also want it to be a good fit for the podcast. If it's not going to be a good fit for the podcast, I remember there's this one podcast. It's actually a very notable podcast. They applied to be part of the network, and we were just like, I just don't think it's going to be a good fit for you. And I don't think it's a good fit for us, but we like your show. And that was a tough one because it's like a very popular podcast that wanted to be part of the network. And we're like, it just doesn't fit. I'm sorry. Oh, that was a tough decision that we had to make. So yes, be very careful on how you evaluate. Okay, Stephen, if you had to give one bit of advice to somebody that wanted to start a podcast network, I've been getting this question a lot lately. What would you tell them?
Make SP do it. No, it's joking. Decide your purpose first. And the reason why I say that is because that's going to really help you with the organization plan of what's going to happen with the network. So, for example, if you're looking simply to collaborate with people like we do on Gonna Geek, it's a lot easier of a process. But if you're looking to profit share, now there's a lot more work. There's a lot more legalities. You might need to get a legal team involved. So I would say decide your purpose for that network first. That will help you set the action plan for developing that network.
Okay. We've discussed the changes in the podcast space before here on Better Podcasting, and I've already said it's been around for 14 years, but we haven't really discussed it since you achieved the 10-year podcasting milestone. So in your 10 years of podcasting, what do you think the biggest change has been since you started?
Obviously. And I believe all of the audience is sitting there right now screaming it at their iDevices or their Android devices because we all know the answer. And I'm surprised that you don't know the answer to this, SP. And it is the fact that Stargate Pioneer is now a podcaster. That is the biggest change within podcasting.
I thought you were going to say the Pixel Buddies were the biggest change in podcasting.
No, not that. No, SP is much, much bigger. No, honestly, it's the technical experience that's required because back in the day, it was a lot harder to get into podcasting. I hand-coded RSS feeds, for example. Also, trying to get media hosting at the time was a lot harder. It was not necessarily as affordable as it was for people. People had to do all sorts of creative tricks to get their files out there. So I think it was a lot more, there was a lot more technical knowledge required back then to get into podcasting. Now, putting aside the reasons we don't recommend Anchor and SoundCloud, the reality is that those two are good examples of ways that people, some podcasters, are able to start podcasting for free. Again, we don't recommend them here at Better Podcasting, but the fact of the matter is that someone who wants to ignore all our advices and just wants to do something for free and easy can do it through Anchor and SoundCloud. So it's just an example on some accessible tools to people who are just trying to get things going. As well, you look at things like Libsyn and Podbean, those have really been refined and they are a lot easier to use in some of the earlier versions. So absolutely, I think that it's a lot easier now for podcasters.
I would agree. It's been easier since I started as well. So you are a network owner. We've established that. You are also a 10-year podcaster. We've established that. And you've started and hosted on multiple shows. We've established that. You have a podcast about podcasting, which I would like to listen to sometime. In all of that, what would you say was your most successful podcast?
All right. Let's just go ahead and say it right now. I'm not going to give one. I'm not going to give one because everyone honestly had their own success merits. We talked about that before. What episode? I don't remember what episode number that was, but we talked about that not long ago, that there's a bunch of different ways that you can weigh success on podcasting. From a video perspective, hands down, GonnaGeek.com show wins. Obviously, I have really embraced video since I came back to it because it was one of my early passions. And so the GonnaGeek.com show, I've had lots of compliments about that. And so it really wins from a video perspective as well. A lot of the ongoing gags and things that we've had in audience engagement definitely comes from the video side of thing on the GonnaGeek.com show. From a personal discovery / core podcast foundation learning, it's not actually my first podcast. It's the Fanboy Buzz. It was a whole different world of podcasting. There was a lot more complex requirements then. And really, I had to learn a lot more trying to develop the Fanboy Buzz. As well, from a personal perspective, it helped me open up. When I look at myself before I did the Fanboy Buzz, I was a lot more reserved, and honestly, I don't think I was a good podcaster. I'm still not a good podcaster, but I was worse then. So it really helped me develop.
That's why I went to the mentoring coaching class. Steven has asked me to help him become a better podcaster.
That's fair. But honestly, it helped me from a personal standpoint. And there was also sort of, because we were trying to get sponsors and trying to monetize it to a degree, there was a lot of learning that I got to do from the Fanboy Buzz from that perspective. Honestly, none of that really applies now because very little of that applies now, I should say, because the space is so different. But I really learned a lot in that regard with Fanboy Buzz. But if I was to step back and look at the overall situation, I promise I'm not saying this just because I'm on the show, but Better Podcasting takes the overall success factor trophy. And that's largely because of sort of the notability that we've got with this show and the audience engagement that we've had with this show. I've had the opportunity through the show to bring up a couple of things that some people now have changed their mind on from an industry perspective. You know, Google SEO is a great example of that, where we've highlighted on the show that RSS feeds are indeed indexed on Google. Also, you and I here, we've really refined the format so that we can offer a new experience each week to the listener, but it's sort of the same format and we can bounce off of each other really well. It doesn't feel like work after this long as it has on previous shows. Like the Fanboy Buzz, by this point, I was starting to feel the fade. But here it doesn't feel like that because we work well together, bounce off each other. And honestly, that audience engagement that we get right now as we record this live on Wednesday, September 5th, 2018, we got a pretty full chat room at Geeks.live. And it just speaks volume to the audience engagement that we have on this show. So overall success factors, it's probably this show, but each of my individual shows have offered their own individual success.
They have. It's been fun to be a part of your 10-year experience. And Stephen, as we start to close out this segment, and with everything that you've spoken about, what is your biggest takeaway from 10 years in podcasting?
So, step 1. Open your wallet. Step 2, take money out. Step 3, pay Stargate Pioneer to do it.
And Stargate Pioneer gets a lot of money because his hourly charge is hefty. So your wallet gets very empty very fast.
No, honestly, it's to just try it out. Try it out. Through all of the different shows that I've done, I've tried things out. Right from that beginning one where I tried out making mic flags. I learned something from that. I learned to do some research before you build something. With Fanboy Buzz, I tried out live streams there. I tried out getting new co-hosts. I tried out different formats, different sort of routine formats. There was all sorts of different things that I've just tried out along the way. And really, that has been the biggest thing that has kept me going. I've never paid for a private podcast group. I've never paid for a podcast consultant. I've never done any of that. And I don't say that, you know, negatively or anything, because there are a lot of benefits that come to those. There's a lot of things I could have done correctly instead of incorrectly by hiring somebody like that. But I ended up learning from those experiences. And whether you try something and you fail or you try it and succeed, you are learning nonetheless. And some of the biggest wins and the biggest things that I've learned have been from the failures. So trying something out and really just stepping back and going, what worked, what didn't work. Absolutely. That's one of the biggest ways that I've been able to, the biggest takeaways that I've had within 10 years of podcasting.
It's a long 10 years. I'll have to wait 2.5 years myself to get there. And I have not been as active as you early in my career. So my hat is off to you. I'm jealous that you started when you did. And thank you very much for sharing all of your insights from 10 years of podcasting, not only in this episode, but the previous 146 episodes of Better Podcasting as well.
Well, it has been an honor podcasting with you, and some of the best memories have come from this show and the GonnaGeek.com show. So that's why I should just retire right now.
That would be nice to be able to retire from podcasting, but I'd still want to do it because it's so fun.
Absolutely. So if you have a question about my 10 years in podcasting or anything else about someone who's been podcasting long term, please get in touch with us through any of the ways. You can tweet us at BetterPod. Find us at facebook.com/betterpodcasting or head on over to betterpodcasting.com. But let's go ahead and move on to the download.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting Download.
We actually got several news stories that crossed our desks in the past 2 weeks. We're going to focus on one in particular. It's because I had a back and forth on Twitter about this. It actually stems from Pod News, and Pod News actually published an article back on August 24th. I said it's been a couple of weeks since we've been podcasting, and it was about pod fade. And the title of the article was how many of the 540,000 podcasts have pod faded. And it was written by Steve Blogstein. And basically it was quoting a bunch of information from Todd Cochran. And Todd Cochran is the CEO and owner of Rod Voice, which is the parent company, I believe, of Blueberry. I'm not actually sure how that's structured, but basically Todd Cochran owns all that. Todd, I have heard over the years, has said a few stats. And one of the stats is that if you release an episode, you get 90% of your lifetime downloads within that first 96 hours of podcasting. I don't know exactly where he's getting the stat because I've never actually heard him actually detail where that stat comes from. All I can say is I'm guessing it comes from his Blueberry stats, which means his company-wide stats for all the podcasts. So I'm guessing it's probably statistically relevant, but I don't know for sure. And I say that stat first because the net stat was that of all the podcasts out there, the 540,000 podcasts, there's an awful lot of podcasts that have not submitted a new episode within the past 90 days. So therefore would be considered by definition for this article pod faded. And I think the point of this article was that even though there's that many shows out, there's a lot of shows that have pod faded. So the space isn't as crowded as you think it could be. And now this is advantageous for anybody that's starting a podcast. There's still a lot of podcasts out there. And if you're looking into a directory like Apple Podcasts or iTunes, that those old shows that still have a lot of subscribers and a lot of downloads might beat you out on the charts. So there's still some impediments from a crowded field, but I wanted to point out one thing with all these stats, and it's part of the Twitter back and forth that I had with Steve, that I had with Pod News. And it was basically that not all the pod faded shows are actually pod faded. So think of it, Stephen, think of it this way. Think of a TV show that you watch a year or 2 years later and you're getting on a streaming service. That is what a lot of podcasts that have evergreen content are today. For example, Serial. All right, everybody knows Serial is a pod, and if you don't know what Serial it was the breakthrough real true crime podcast that came out a couple of years ago that everybody raved about. People are still finding that podcast and listening to that podcast because it is a popular podcast and it was a short series. Now, as the time that I was writing these show notes and that I was replying, I had not heard that Serial was going to gen up a season 3. They just announced a season 3, but it had 2 seasons and that was it. And I thought they were going to leave it alone, but no, there's going to be a season 3. So that's just an example, something that comes out for a little bit and people download it like crazy and then they stop producing and it's still a relevant podcast. And the reason I'm saying this on this show is because if you are a hobby podcaster and you're creating some great timeless content, for instance, The Story Behind by Emily Prokop, right? Another great listener of the show. Her podcasts are mostly timeless. There's some time relevant content in there, but you can go back and listen to those forever. I mean, I listen to some podcasts that are trivia based that are basically timeless because they're factual data from the past. It's not really current news. And so you could have a podcast like that as long as it's evergreen content, it could still go on. Now, the truth of the matter is, if you're part of this vast wave of podcasts that are pod fading after 3 episodes, after 8 episodes, odds are likely that you're not going to get the sustained downloads of an evergreen content podcast, or that you've developed a following that people will listen to your 3 podcasts 1 million times each. It's probably not going to happen, especially if you're not somebody that's famous. And even if you are somebody that's famous, that's in doubt too. But I just wanted to point out that if you do stop podcasting and you have evergreen content, your content is still relevant, whether you're making it as a hobby or as a business. Stephen, what do you think?
Yeah, I gotta say that the whole term pod faded is really the true problem with this statistic, because of the fact that it's been defined as whatever it was, and within the last 90 days haven't put an episode out. There are many podcasts that specifically only release a batch of episodes X amount of months. And so this calls those pod faded, even though they might be specifically on break as they've outlined according to their show. By this definition, right now, most television shows have TV faded because they haven't been active in 90 days, right? Like regular season TV, right? How much of those wrapped up in April or May or whatever, and now it's August. So there's certain structures that people do put on their podcast. There's no rule, and someone can write me, and they can even send me an expletive GIF if I'm wrong on this. But as far as I know, there's no rule that says that you have to conform to this release standards for a podcast. So there could be somebody who goes, I'm releasing podcasts over the summer, and it's my summer program, and then I'm going to move on to my fall program. Then I move on to my winter program and so forth. So that's absolutely, I think, a big flaw with this whole statistic is that people are calling all podcasts that have not released within 90 days as pod faded.
Yeah, I would agree with that. In that same article, by the way, there was also another link to a Chartable blog article. Did you see this? The top podcast hosting platforms?
No, I didn't.
So go ahead and you can look it up, and they list the 13 top podcasting hosts. Now, we've known for a while, by the way, that SoundCloud was the number one podcasting host out there. They had, at one point in time, they had like between 40 and 45,000 RSS feeds attributed to them. The problem that we have with SoundCloud is they're not focusing on podcasting as a primary business model. They could go out of business at any time. We don't know. And more importantly, their stats are not IAB2 compliant. They're not moving there. There's been no announcement on that. And they haven't even adopted the new Apple ID3 tags that came out at WWDC 2017. So that's more than a year ago now. So SoundCloud is number one. I mean, I get it. It's a good value, and people think that they're discoverable on there. But as for podcasts, it's not great. So Anchor is number two, and that's surprising to me. With 9.6, SoundCloud's at 14.4%, by the way, and Anchor's at 9.6. I want to mention Anchor because they just started their podcasting model earlier this year. They've changed. They've morphed from one sort of internet voice communications app to now a podcast host, and they have 9.6 of the R's. I think here's the fallacy here, because I think you're going to get a lot of pod-faded shows from Anchor, a lot of shows, because it's free and people will go there. We don't recommend Anchor. We talked about it earlier on the show. And then the next four are Libsyn, Podomatic, Podbean, and Blueberry. And out of those, I would recommend Libsyn and Podbean. So it's good that some of the ones that we recommend are at the top there, but I would be worried if I was just I mean, you're listening to the show because you want to make your podcast better. I would stay away from SoundCloud and Anchor, but also know that Libsyn and Podbean are in the top 5 as well.
Yeah, that's some really good stats. And we'll make sure when you head to betterpodcasting.com/146, we have the link there. Well, thank you very much for digging this up, Stargate Pioneer. Any final thoughts on that?
No, just, make sure that you are continuing to improve on your podcast. That's your segment that you did before. And I think this segment proves it as well, whether you're talking about pod fading, protecting your show from pod fading, or you're protecting your show from the long term on a good media host.
Oh, and by the way, every 89 days release an episode, even if it's just blank, because it'll pass the test, right? Just a blank dead air episode every 89 days.
So yeah, as long as it's valid in the RSS feed, you're good.
Wait, hold on. You can go ahead, and I'm legally allowing you to extract this upcoming section here. This podcast will return soon. You can go ahead and cut that out, put that in your feed every 89 days. Go ahead, take that audio, put that in your feed every 89 days. Let's go ahead and move on to Better Podback.
Please.
All right, in the Better Podback world this week, let's go ahead and kick it off with a tweet from AureliaPod. That's AureliaPod. After today's How I Saved My Podcast, I am reminded of a question I've had in the past. For those of us who use a Zoom H6 for recording and have all local hosts, brackets so nothing is routed to a PC by default, what would the best way to add redundancy be?
So, Stephen, what I would do is I would go do the same thing that I'm doing right now on the podcast, and I would go from the line out of the Zoom H6. I would go into a PC. Now, I'm streaming to our Spreaker feed that way, but you could record into Audacity. It'll just be one track, but you could do it, and I think that's a great way to add redundancy with an H6.
I agree, along with that mindset, as long as you're previewing to make sure that you're hearing the H6 stuff. Because if you're not listening to the H6 stuff, at that point, if you don't have it activated right, then that line out's not going to go anywhere. The other thing that I would say with that as well is that I agree with that method going somewhere. I would also encourage somebody to look into an adapter to go to their smartphone, because that might be a little more accessible to go into like an iRig or even just a basic downgraded, 3.5 millimeter adapter, TRRS adapter sort of thing to get it into your phone. I think that would be a really good way to do a backup recording, because if all else fails, even though that might not be as good as your H6, at least it's a recording. But I agree, out of the line out's the way to go.
You could actually, now thinking about that, I like the smartphone thing because everybody's got a smartphone, but you could even go to a less expensive digital recorder. You have a Zoom H1, right? So you could do that. You could go out of your H6 into the Zoom One and have that be your backup recording. And actually, that way you'd have a stereo track. I don't know how you get a stereo out from the H. I guess you'd have to pan the channels, but you could do it. So yeah, that's a good way to do it as well.
The best other way to do it is to build soundproof rooms for each participant. Obviously, then Skype each other. So now you are Skyping. Use the new Skype recording feature. Make sure you're going in through a mobile phone, of course, because it's not on Windows yet. And then there you go. It's highly complicated, but at least you got a backup.
There are a lot of ways to achieve redundancy with a Zoom H6. I have not had, as long as I've hit record, if I'm monitoring, I have not had the H6 fail on me yet. More on that later in the podcast. Okay, Covert Nerd got to us, and he basically was wishing you a good vacation. He said, enjoy your time off. You've earned it. He didn't just say to send it to you. He sent it to both of us, but it was your vacation. So we'll just go with that.
He was actually meaning that you, SP, have earned your time away from me. That's what he was meaning.
Lord knows I need time away from Steven. Yep.
Exactly. We also had DX Ferris say, what's an episode bracket S? So what's episodes or episode in which you discuss reducing and eliminating ambient noise, like how to record quality audio while the air conditioner is running or the missus is upstairs walking around asking for a friend.
Thanks. I'll take my answer off the air. We actually have to get back to you, Ferris. I don't know when he'll actually get a chance to listen to this. But for everybody else that actually saw the tweet, basically the best way is to get yourself a dynamic cardioid microphone. And we've talked about them a lot on this podcast. I mean, I'm using an RE320. Steven's using an Audio-Technica BP40. But the ones that we've said before, the 2005 2100 and the Samsung Q2U are good as well. So that's the number one thing that I would say. I think we've talked about this on an episode. I'd have to research, and maybe we need to revise it. So there might be an episode upcoming soon that talks about this.
Yeah. And honestly, one of the best things that I would say as far as making sure that there is no noise is accept that there will be noise and work around that. Because if you try to assume that you're not going to have noise, you're setting unrealistic standard as a hobby podcaster. So try to work within the reality, and that'll hopefully help you reduce it.
I'll even say that my co-host on Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D., Lauren, she actually does voiceover for her job now, and she lives in an apartment, so she has people above her, below her, on the sides, and she has to deal with noise pollution issues all the time. The one apartment above her has a dog that they haven't clipped the nails, and it's hardwood floors, so there's all that shh, and she just learns to stop recording and start again. It's the perils of recording at home. You could build yourself a sound booth, but that's thousands of dollars, and she's looking at getting a down payment on a house and moving out that way. So it happens in all sorts of audio issues. So Ferris, if you happen to be listening to this, we've already gotten in touch with you, but those are some easy ways to control audio. Actually, Stephen, we also had a tweet from our friend Jonathan Bloom, and he said, hearing your comment on listening to podcasts while walking listening to podcasts. How meta. Mind blown. Yeah.
Very, very meta. And finally, we also got a message from Jonathan Bloom, who had said that he was talking with another podcaster, mentioned Better Podcasting, and they said, you listen to that too? So hi to both of you. Hi to both of you, and hi to the other two people that you're going to talk to next week that you find out are also listening.
That's right. So since the person that he was talking to listens to Better Podcasting, if you were talking to Jonathan Bloom and had that conversation, we would love to know what your podcast name is so we could say it on the air. Please let us know what it is. We would love to talk about it on the show here.
So make sure to tell Jonathan Bloom about it so he can tell us. No, I'm just joking. So there you go. That's the end of the official Better Podback segment. However, I'm just checking my sources here, just typing in here to the instant chat room here, and what am I seeing? And I'm seeing a random message that we have from a Stargate Pioneer, and he's telling me, well, I'll just read it out. The email says, Dear Stephen, I know that you're a trustworthy podcaster. For a long time, I've listened to your show. I've actually followed you for about 10 years. And what wonderful work you do. One challenge that I recently faced is that my Zoom H6 went under. That's right, my faithful Zoom H6 was working fine up until a few weeks ago, where I started to see some weird anomalies. As I went to record my latest episode of Better Podcasting, episode 146, I was connected with my amazing looking co-host, Steven, and all of a sudden he couldn't hear me and I couldn't hear him. Please help. That's the email that I got from this Stargate Pioneer.
All right. So truth in lending here, the email was never sent. Steven just made that up on the spot. But we did have trouble. More importantly, I had trouble before we started podcasting because I couldn't get my microphone into channel 1 of the Zoom H6. I've had this issue intermittently for the past month and a half or so. And I've always been able to restart the Zoom H6 by pulling out the plug, basically, and putting it back in, turning it back on. And I never really had a chance to sit down and diagnose it. Remember, Stephen, that I was without air conditioning for about a week in the sweltering heat and humidity? Remember that?
I do.
I think that contributed to the problem, but I think in the diagnosis of the H6 and trying to make it work, I think I've ran into a culprit. And I took out the AAA batteries. And if you're on the YouTube, you might be able to see some corrosion, as we call it, in the engineering world, in the space engineering, the astro engineering world. Yeah, there's corrosion on the H6 batteries, which of course led to the corrosion leaking out in the battery compartment. And I'm holding up the battery compartment of the H6 for the YouTube viewer. And yeah, we were able to get channels 3 and 4 working tonight. So I have my track covered. I have Steven's inbound track covered. I actually, talking about redundancy, Steven asked, and I fully went with it. It's been years since I've done this, but I spun up Audacity and I'm recording an extra track, a backup in Audacity, just me. And then there is, of course, my track on Steven's end, and there's the Spreaker backup and the YouTube backup. So we have backups in case the H6 completely failed. So I wasn't worried about it. But this will be the last use of my H6. That was the first H6 that I bought many years ago. I do have that backup that's in my mobile bag, and we've kind of talked about it before the show. We've decided that I will be swapping them out. I will be retiring this H6. And Zoom, if you happen to ever be listening to this, if you want me to ship it to you and you want to try to fix it and see what a damaged unit looks like, we can make that available. But if not, I'm not going to bother giving this to anybody else because I don't want them to have any issues. We're actually slightly concerned that the audio won't sound good in it, which is why we did the backups. But in the future, I might look at a different workflow, different hardware to actually record my audio. But for now, I think the Zoom H6 backup will now be the prime. And if I ever have to go anywhere and do a panel or whatever, I'll take it off and do it. And we might be doing some of those panels again next year. So I might have to recap my gear in the holiday season for next year. But yeah, the Zoom H6, this is the first Zoom H6 I've heard of not working due to just use. So I still think it's a great buy. I would just encourage you to check the battery compartment every couple of months, because especially if you're in heat and humidity, because this sort of thing can happen. And it was one of the reasons why I didn't want to power on all my gear while I was without air conditioning, because I didn't want the heat and the humidity to actually degrade the electrical components. I don't know if that's what happened here, but I can't think that it contributed to the rapid expansion of the corrosion. So that's it. That's the big news here from the Stargate Pioneer studio.
Well, I will say you've had a good run with it. There's been a lot of good podcasts recorded on there, many SD cards worth, and I hope that whatever you choose works for you in the future with it. And in the meantime, if you have had yourself leaky batteries, please get in touch with Stargate Pioneer in any of the ways. You can hit us up at twitter.com/betterpod, facebook.com/betterpodcasting, or head on over to betterpodcasting.com. Or best yet, find Jonathan Bloom and tell him about it. That's the best
And
way.
he'll tell us.
Exactly. So there you go. So for episode number 146 of Better Podcasting, I'm Stephen John Drew saying I am honored this has been such a wonderful part of my 10 years podcasting.
And I'm Stargate Pioneer saying this has been the funnest interview I've ever done.
It shouldn't be. I'm a terrible interview. Bye.
See everybody next week. Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This has been a Gonna Geek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week. Here's your host for the show, Stephen John Drew and Stargate Pioneer.
Fixing SP's video on the fly, trying to make him centered right now. Yes, I am, but I can't switch scenes because I'm in preview mode. Fixing his video, fixing it right now. Yes, there we go. I think I have it fixed. Hello and welcome to an all-new episode of Better Podcasting.